Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to a deep dive into, well, a period of intense, unexpected political upheaval.
Hmm.
We're zeroing in on the final turbulent months of the Biden presidency and the sudden, unprecedented challenge faced by the Harris campaign that followed. And this is all based on a stack of internal accounts, notes, and reports shared by you, our listener.
Yes, and what's really fascinating here, I think, is that this material gives us a unique, often kind of unflinching look behind the curtain.
Yep.
At the data, the dynamics, the really difficult decisions people were facing during this pivotal moment.
Right, because this was a moment of massive political shift, triggered, as these sources describe it, after a key event specifically, President Biden dropping out after that debate. And that decision plunged the Democratic Party into this rapid, totally unexpected campaign sprint. So our mission today is to distill the key nuggets from these sources. What did the situation truly look like internally? What was the strategic tightrope Harris walked? The specific incidents that created challenges, and maybe the broader questions the period raised about things like presidential fitness, loyalty, the mechanics of power.
And importantly, we'll stick strictly to what the source material tells us. We're presenting the events, the perspectives described within these accounts. We're not taking sides on any political viewpoints here. This is really about understanding the internal narrative these sources lay out.
All right, let's jump right into the immediate aftermath. After that debate, President Biden drops out. These sources paint a pretty vivid and frankly grim picture of the scene. Others quickly endorsed Harris. The call goes out to key players like David Plouffe.
Yeah, and one perspective that really stands out in these accounts is Plouffe's. He was apparently hoping for an earlier end to Biden's run after the debate, maybe some other process. He saw Harris's prospects as, well, remote, but crucially, at least not zero, which he felt was better than Biden's position at that point. He viewed the situation, according to his account here, as a 107-day sprint to save the country from Trump. That's pretty stark phrasing.
Wow.
So when Harris called him, asked him to help, he talked it over with his family and ultimately decided it was the only solid thing to do. So he said yes.
So he comes aboard. But as these sources detail, there just wasn't time to build a whole new campaign from scratch, right?
Right.
Harris kept much of the Biden infrastructure, including campaign chair Jen O'Malley-Dillon. Mike Donilon leaves the campaign, goes back to the White House.
And this is where the internal data revealed what one source called the gruesome reality.
Yeah.
With new people coming on, O'Malley-Dillon convened a meeting, and the campaign's internal info, which had apparently been very closely held during the Biden-Donilon era, was finally shared widely. Becca Siegel shared it with everyone, including pollsters like Guerin, Murphy, Pollock, and Binder, who'd been sort of iced out before.
And when they got that first look at the numbers, the right track, wrong track stuff, the splits among different demographics, the sources say the reality became crystal clear. Plouffe knew it was bad, but these internal numbers were reportedly even worse than he'd anticipated.
Yeah.
The sources quote this period as Biden barreling toward a historic loss for the modern era, an electoral bloodbath. Wow, bloodbath. That's intense language from inside a campaign.
It really is. And it showed Biden was on track to lose not just the critical blue wall states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and the Sun Belt battlegrounds, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, but crucially, according to the data shared in these accounts, he was also in serious danger of losing states like New Hampshire, New Mexico, Maine, Minnesota, and even Virginia. Places you wouldn't expect.
Right. And Plouffe's estimation in these sources was that this data might not even have been the absolute bottom. He guessed that if Biden had actually continued campaigning as he had been post-debate, things could have gotten even worse. He thought Biden's popular vote could have fallen another 3 or 4 points, maybe ending around 44%, leading to the House falling by dozens of votes, Republicans maybe winning 58 Senate seats, a real wipeout scenario.
And the accounts note that despite these, well, ugly facts, they didn't really have time to wallow.
Oh.
The Democratic convention was kicking off just 4 weeks later, August 19th. They had to pick a running mate, start running ads, navigate this completely unprecedented situation.
Unprecedented is definitely the word. One description in these sources calls what the Harris campaign was attempting unfathomably difficult.
Yeah, and if you connect this to the bigger picture, like look at the Obama campaign launching back in February 2007. These sources point out it took him and his team over a year to really get cooking, work out policy positions, air any dirty laundry, vet himself thoroughly.
Right.
Harris, in the scenario laid out, had just 3 months. 3 months to introduce herself, define her candidacy, all under this intense pressure. That comparison really highlights the scale of the challenge.
The sources do mention one sort of small gift from this accelerated timeline. Apparently, it forced fast decision-making, prevented them from sweating the small stuff.
Right.
But these accounts make it very clear this was the only positive mentioned in the context of this sudden sprint.
And another challenge noted here is the lack of prior data. The Biden campaign, according to these sources, had done basically no real polling on Harris beyond maybe some focus groups. So the new campaign was essentially starting from scratch in understanding her standing with the electorate, which, seems surprising after 4 years as VP.
It really does. Now, despite that incredibly difficult starting point, the sources do note some initial good news for her campaign. In the weeks right after her announcement, apparently many straying Democratic voters returned to the fold. The accounts say they expressed increased enthusiasm for her candidacy. It brought the race within striking distance.
Yeah, but what's fascinating here is balancing that little bit of good news against the headwinds she faced, which are described in the sources as ferociously blowing anti-incumbency winds globally, layered with these tough anti-Biden administration gusts. That would have challenged any Democrat, let alone the sitting vice president.
And these accounts do acknowledge her strengths, too. They say she had a solid run right after her announcement and reportedly handily won her debate with Trump.
But the limitations are also detailed very clearly in the sources. They know she hadn't spent the previous 4 years doing the kind of reps you need, tough interviews, mixing it up with skeptical voters. And crucially, she hadn't really done the work to erase the far-left positions she'd taken back in 2020 to win the nomination. That's presented as a hurdle that just, persisted.
So given this whole situation, what did these sources reveal about the main strategic challenge Harris herself faced? What was the core issue?
Well, these accounts really highlight a central dilemma. Biden was clearly a liability, but it was never clear what she could do or was willing to do about it.
It seems like there was this constant tension reported in these sources about how to navigate that specific problem.
So top strategists were talking to her about this difficult balance.
Exactly. According to the sources, they discussed how to appeal to those crucial up-for-grab voters, never Trump Republicans, independents, disaffected Democrats without alienating the essential Democratic base. It's a classic tightrope walk. And were there specific policy areas mentioned where this conflict played out?
Yes, the sources mentioned specific areas where she apparently privately disagreed with Biden, but felt she couldn't raise those disagreements publicly. Like, Israel's war in Gaza was seen as just too politically fraught, raising concerns about stimulus spending and inflation. Well, that would prompt questions about why she hadn't spoken up earlier.
Right, where were you?
Exactly. And addressing border security would invite questions about her own actions in her previous portfolio. These were described in the accounts as no-win situations for her.
So strategists were pushing her to distinguish herself more.
They were, according to these accounts. One suggestion attributed to Plouffe in the sources was basically, at the very least, you need to say, look, these are new ideas. These are different ideas. I look at the world a little differently than Joe Biden. Just signal some difference.
But the sources detail her reluctance to do that.
Yeah, she reportedly asked, if I were to really distinguish myself, how would that make me look? And she answered her own question, according to these sources, disloyal. That one word seems to capture the bind she felt she was in. And the sources also note there were these added complications that pollsters couldn't even measure. It wasn't just about being a VP perceived as disloyal. It was being a woman VP disloyal to a man president, a black woman VP disloyal to a white man president. The campaign, these sources say, wanted to introduce her as a breath of fresh air, definitely not a backstabber.
And it's also noted in the sources that she had genuine appreciation for the opportunity Biden had given her, a close personal relationship with and great affection for Joe.
Right. So these accounts suggest she just wouldn't go as far as maybe some on her campaign team wanted her to in distancing herself.
Okay, so what's fascinating here is how this dynamic played out publicly. The sources point to a specific moment on The View on October 8th as being particularly problematic.
Yeah. Sonny Austin asked her about the biggest specific difference between her presidency and potential Biden second term. Harris initially responded, about them being different people, bringing her own sensibilities.
But then, when Austin pressed her on whether she would have done anything differently during the past 4 years.
That's when the sources quote Harris's reply, "There is not a thing that comes to mind." And these sources call this perhaps the worst moment of her short campaign, arguing she presented herself as just more the same at a time when most people, according to polls, thought the country was on the wrong track.
And the immediate consequence, according to the accounts.
Reportedly, it provided new footage for a brand new Trump TV ad almost instantly.
Ouch. These accounts also describe her having a tough time acknowledging the actual reason why Biden was no longer the nominee. There was a CNN interview with Dana Bash on August 29th.
Yes. Bash asked about Harris's really staunch defense of Biden's capacity right after the debate, and if she had any regrets about what she told the American people then.
In her response,
The sources quote Harris's response as, "No, not at all," insisting Biden had the necessary intelligence, commitment, judgment, disposition, based on the hours she spent with him in the Oval Office and the Situation Room. And the sources say this was largely what she also told her strategists privately. It was her consistent line.
Now, the sources offer a sort of layered analysis of this response, right? It wasn't necessarily straightforward.
Right. They say it could have been honest, given a VP's relatively limited day-to-day interaction, maybe Biden's ability to lead specific meetings well, rising to the occasion in certain situations, especially national security. But the sources also say she wasn't claiming she'd never seen him as, an old man growing weaker and frailer, but that even privately, she would maintain he was always in command in those key moments she witnessed. It's presented as her specific perspective in these accounts.
And the sources suggest that those closest to Biden, maybe including Harris in some ways, were grading him on a curve.
That's the phrasing used, yeah. Separating his ability to make sound decisions from the energy and communication skills needed for a really competitive campaign.
Yeah.
And the sources note she couldn't exactly tell voters, well, I didn't see the president day to day. That would have been politically pretty difficult.
Okay, so beyond the whole debate over acknowledging the reason for the change, the sources detail specific public incidents where Biden himself became a liability for the campaign. One example given is the Shanksville 9/11 event in Pennsylvania.
Right. On September 11th, after an event honoring victims, Biden visited a fire department. He was given a hat, offered his presidential cap to an elderly man who was wearing a Trump 2024 hat. The sources recount the exchange. The man asked if Biden remembered his name. Biden reportedly replied, "I don't remember my name, I'm slow." The man then called him, "You're an old fart." Biden playfully responded, "Yeah, I know, man. I'm an old guy." And then, "I know you would know about that," when the man repeated it. And then Biden took the Trump hat. He initially said, "I ain't going that far," when someone urged him to put it on, but then he did. He plopped it right on his head.
And that image, of course, went instantly viral. The Trump campaign immediately posted it. Thanks for the support, Joe.
Exactly. And these accounts report Harris's reaction was something like, "What is he doing? This is completely unhelpful and so unnecessary."
So the sources state the Harris campaign decided right then this would be the last time she would do a public event with the president before the election. That's a pretty dramatic decision for a campaign to make.
It really is. But these sources explicitly state it was not the last time that Biden did something unhelpful. Another incident highlighted is from New Hampshire, October 22nd.
What happened there?
Biden was speaking about Trump and presidential immunity, and according to the sources, he said Trump thinks he has a right to actually physically eliminate, shoot, kill someone who he believes to be a threat to him.
Wow.
And then he added, "We got to lock him up," before quickly correcting himself to politically lock him up.
Yeah.
But the damage, the sources note, was done. It immediately gave ammo to Republicans accusing the Justice Department of being weaponized.
Okay, and the sources describe one of the worst moments coming just a week before the election, October 29th, right before a planned Harris speech.
Yes, right before she was scheduled to deliver a big speech on national unity. A comedian at a Trump rally had made this crude joke about Puerto Rico being a floating island of garbage. The sources note that many Republicans, even Trump himself, condemned the joke. The Trump campaign actually, uncharacteristically, issued a statement denouncing it. So it set up this perfect contrast for Harris's unity speech.
And then what happened?
And then, according to these sources, Joe Biden entered the chat, basically, via a Zoom call. Commenting on the controversy, he reportedly said, "The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters."
Oh, no.
Yeah. The sources described the White House Communications Office trying desperately to spin this, insisting there was a possessive apostrophe needed, that Biden only meant his supporters' garbage, referring to the comedian. The sources called this attempt preposterous. Trump, of course, immediately seized on it, compared it to Hillary Clinton's deplorable comment asking, "Garbage, I think, is worse."
Yeah.
Right? And the next day, He appeared with a Trump-branded garbage truck in Wisconsin, reportedly calling it in honor of Kamala and Joe Biden. Just a brutal visual.
And Harris's reaction, according to these accounts.
These accounts quote her reaction to her team as, "What are we going to do about this?" noting that Biden had completely stepped all over her speech and saved Trump from a spiraling news cycle. It's a pretty blunt assessment from inside her own team.
So these sources summarize this whole period by stating that while Harris maybe helped the Democratic Party stabilize, her own candidacy was just barely treading water.
And the albatross that was Joe Biden kept getting heavier. That's the direct quote from one source.
The sources also include this anecdote about Anita Dunn quoting lines she attributed to The Godfather about revenge and enemies at a farewell party right before the election.
Yeah, which some attendees apparently found odd or maybe revealing given the circumstances, despite Dunn's explanation. The sources also note, as a fact check, that the quotes aren't exactly from the films referenced. It's just a strange little detail included in the accounts.
Okay, so as the Biden presidency neared its end, the sources described the atmosphere. Biden kept working, but was reportedly resentful?
Yes, these accounts highlight a moment on January 5th after signing some legislation. He responded to an age question by saying, "My being the oldest president, I know more world leaders than any one of you ever met in your whole goddamn life." The sources describe this as a kind of moment of accomplishment marred by a lashing out.
And this period also brought some really controversial actions revealed in the sources. They detailed the Hunter Biden pardon on December 1st, described as full, unconditional, covering 11 years.
Despite Biden's repeated public promises that he wouldn't do it. Yeah.
And the sources report on the context provided around that.
They do. Hunter's lawyer, Abby Lowell, released a report that contained a false assertion that Garland kept Weiss in place because of the Hunter investigation. These accounts actually question if Biden even remembered that he was the one who made the call to keep Weiss. Lowell's statement about Trump's supposed enemies list and the real threat after the election is also quoted in these sources as part of the justification.
And Biden's own justification for the pardon is included in these accounts.
Yes, he felt the charges came from political opponents, that raw politics has infected this process, leading to a miscarriage of justice. That was his stated reasoning, according to the sources.
But the reactions detailed in the sources show significant internal conflict over this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Attorney General Garland was reportedly tremendously disappointed. Special Counsel Weiss was upset. The sources quote, Weiss's rebuttal directly. "I prosecuted the 2 cases against Mr. Biden because he broke the law. He called Biden's accusations gratuitous and wrong and said they maligned the public servants based solely on false accusations." I mean, that's a pretty rare public rebuke from a special counsel against a sitting president.
And some in the White House, according to these sources, were also troubled.
Yes, they reportedly worked for Biden, believing he was committed to the judicial norms Trump broke. And they wondered why he didn't focus solely on the pardon as being, a father's act. The sources state this pardon, along with Biden's post-debate behavior, had some of the president's own aides making uncomfortable comparisons between Biden and Trump. That's a really striking detail to find in these internal accounts.
Wow. And the sources also include a comment from a Trump legal advisor.
Yeah, who reportedly told CNN that the Hunter Biden pardon gave them a great deal of leeway on whether they could pardon January 6th insurrectionists, sort of opening the door.
Then, in the very last minutes of the administration, the sources reveal final preemptive pardons for family members.
Yes, Biden's brothers, Jimmy and Frank, his sister Valerie, and 2 spouses. Biden's justification was reportedly fear of Trump weaponizing the DOJ, but the sources note Jimmy Biden's business activities had faced scrutiny. These accounts say this was seen by many Democrats as another ignominious act, putting family interests ahead of the party and the country.
And these sources contrast this with Trump's immediate action right after inauguration.
Right, offering a full, complete, and unconditional pardon to roughly 1,250 January 6th offenders, many who assaulted law enforcement. This was despite his advisors claiming there'd be a review process. It seems, according to these accounts, both administrations used this power in ways that drew controversy.
What also stands out in these sources are observations of, physical and cognitive decline during the last foreign trips mentioned.
Yes, these sources give some specific examples. In Manaus, Brazil, Biden apparently stuck strictly to his script, was shuffling, and reportedly looked like he was disappearing into the jungle. In Angola, the sources note President Lourenço grabbed Biden's arm to help him with a step, and exhibits were brought out at a museum, presumably because stairs were difficult for him. These anecdotes are quite specific and paint a picture.
And the reaction of Democrats and longtime Biden aides described in the sources is pretty striking.
Yeah, watching in disbelief, asking things like, how did we ever think he could do this for another 4 years? And how did he think he could? The sources mention talk of Stockholm Syndrome, self-blame, finger-pointing among those involved, on a second-guessing after the fact.
These accounts even include a, quote, expressing anger at Jill, asking, how do you not recognize that the person you live with is in decline?
Yeah, and a former senior aide is quoted calling the whole situation scandalous and saying it was obvious for quite a while that there was no chance he would be able to serve out a full term. These are really blunt assessments found within the sources shared with us.
Which naturally brings us to the broader medical and constitutional questions discussed in these sources.
Right. Dr. Jonathan Reiner, an internist who has consulted for the White House Medical Unit, shares his view in these accounts. He talks about a steep cognitive and physical decline. He suggests the White House might have declined cognitive testing or imaging specifically to avoid having data they'd have to report, which he feels violates that responsibility to inform the public of the whole truth.
And there's an anonymous perspective from a top cognitive neurologist.
Yes, who shares in the sources that he and colleagues were concerned about the consistency of the problems they saw publicly even before the debate. They were apparently texting specialist colleagues, speculating on his condition. The debate itself reportedly looked like clear evidence of some kind of brain disorder to them, leading them to believe it would eventually declare itself conclusively, though they had different theories, Lewy body dementia, Alzheimer's, etc. That shows the level of private medical speculation the sources captured.
Now, these sources acknowledge that some doctors find diagnosis from afar irresponsible.
Right, but they reiterate Reiner's point. Biden's own doctors are up close and, in his view, have a responsibility for transparency that might not have been met.
What's fascinating here, too, is the historical and constitutional context provided in these accounts. They make a point of saying Biden is not Richard Nixon, and this situation is not Watergate, but an entirely separate scandal. That's an interesting distinction they draw.
It is. The sources touch on the evolution of succession and disability protocols, the Tyler precedent, the 25th Amendment. They explain the 25th Amendment process, the VP and cabinet declaring the president unable, noting it would require an inordinate amount of courage, a very high bar.
And these sources present a nuanced view regarding fitness versus the actual constitutional requirements, don't they?
They do. Few critics quoted say Biden was always unable. Many supporters believed him fit, and his closest advisors, the sources suggest, might have been lying to themselves more than knowingly deceiving the public. The sources note he had moments of incoherence, of a stark inability to communicate or recognize people or recall important facts. Yet even critics continued to attest to his ability to make sound decisions, just maybe on his own schedule.
The key takeaway from these sources on this point seems to be
that while this description is certainly not optimal for a president, the Constitution sets minimum requirements. It doesn't necessarily require self-awareness or bravery or selflessness in these specific situations.
Finally, the sources return to a specific broken promise.
Yes, they remind the listener of Biden's pledge to Jake Tapper back in September 2020. The sources quote, Biden promising he would be totally transparent in terms of my health and all aspects of my health if anything significant occurred.
And the source's conclusion on that?
Pretty direct. He was not.
These accounts also note Biden's belief, even at the very end, that he actually could have won the election, which is attributed to what the sources call sugar-coated falsities from advisors like Mike Donilon and Nancy Pelosi.
Right. And the sources report Harris was reportedly incensed by this claim. Biden apparently apologized to her later. And in one of his last press availabilities, he tried to fix it with what these sources called the nonsensical claim that either he or Harris could have beaten Trump. Just trying to smooth things over, it seems.
And the sources also mention some final details, like Biden's post-presidency transition being tied closely to Jill's office, many aides having worked for the First Lady, and maybe some troubles with the Presidential Library fundraising.
Yeah, just some closing notes in the accounts. They also include an Archibald Cox quote from the Watergate era about the corrupt influence of great power and subordinates pleasing that one man. It's presented as maybe a relevant lesson here, even though the situations are obviously different. That dynamic of power and loyalty.
And finally, these sources offer a thought on how to prevent something like this from happening again, mentioning Dr. Reiner's suggestion.
Yes, that Congress could potentially legally require the president's physician to formally certify fitness, maybe even under penalty of perjury. Because the sources note the current yearly letter is just tradition, and the information released is entirely controlled by the White House. Without a law, the sources argue, no president can really be counted on to be fully open about their health if they don't want to be.
Wow. Okay. We've really taken a deep dive through the source material. We've seen the internal panic described, the seemingly impossible task handed to Harris, the specific moments where the challenges of the Biden presidency impacted the campaign, the painful reflections of aides afterwards, and these differing perspectives on fitness from both political and medical viewpoints, all is described in these sources you shared.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is connecting the threads that run through all these accounts. That tension between loyalty and political necessity, the consequences maybe of a lack of transparency, the enduring questions about how we assess our leaders' capacity, and just the stark realities behind the political facade that are presented in these particular sources.
So now, for you, our listener, who shared these accounts with us, having heard us unpack them, what stands out to you now from these accounts?
And reflecting on this blend of personal relationships, political maneuvering, and the challenges around transparency about a president's health and capacity, as depicted only in these sources we've discussed today, what does this make you think about the information we receive as citizens and maybe the dynamics of power at the very highest level?